Okay. Yeah.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. I would like to remind you that after the session is over, we do need to completely clear the room. If you would like to continue conversations after that, please do so out in the hall so that we can get seated for the next session. And I'd like to welcome Jessica Hardcastle, Cybersecurity Editor for the Register. Today, she's going to be moderating a panel on Running in the Shadow, Perspectives on Securing the Software Supply Chain.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for joining us. Again, I'm Jessica Lyons Hardcastle, Cybersecurity Editor at the Register, and I'm joined by three people who have very different roles in the software supply chain ecosystem to share their perspectives. First, we have a government policy advisor, Camille Stewart-Gloucester. She is the Deputy National Cyber Director, Technology and Ecosystem Security for the White House Office of the National Cyber Director. We also have a supply chain security provider, Dan Lawrence. He is the CEO and co-founder of ChainGuard. And then we have a Chief Information Security Officer who works for a company that has almost 400 million daily users, Jim Higgins, the CISO of Snap. So thank you all for being with us today. And to kick things off, I'm hoping that each of you can give a quick overview of what you do and what a typical day looks like for you tackling software supply chain security. So Camille, let's start it off with you.
Sure. So how many of you are familiar with the Office of the National Cyber Director? Yes. I love when I get hands raised, right? We're a new office, and so many have heard of it but aren't familiar with what we do. The Office of the National Cyber Director is organizing national cyber policy around an affirmative vision for a digital ecosystem that is secure, defensible, resilient, and aligns with our values. That work spans four major principles: federal cohesion. How do we get all of the federal partners working together? How do we make sure we are leveraging our authorities in the best way possible? Set national priorities that we all can move towards. Public-private collaboration, and I say private in the broadest sense, so all non-federal partners, our international partners, nonprofits, industry, state and local government, everyone. How do we all get aligned around the same national priorities? How do we collaborate? Not the public-private partnerships of the past where we're just kind of indicator sharing. How do we truly collaborate around what we need to do, what each of our roles are to achieve that vision that I stated? Aligning resources to aspirations. Have any of you ever had an unfunded mandate? It's the worst. No money to do the thing that everybody tells you need to do. So we're trying to remediate that as well. How do we make sure we align resources, people resources, monetary resources, such that we can meet those priorities? And then present and future resilience. And my division is really focused on that future resilience piece. How do we think about getting towards that digital ecosystem that's thriving and we all can share in by focusing on the future resilience of technology and the future resilience of people? So emerging tech, supply chains, privacy, all of those things, as well as the cyber workforce. How do we make sure we have the people to do this work, and how do we make sure we are equipping every American to be able to own the technology that governs their lives and is a part of their lives and facilitates so much of what we do every day?
Go ahead, Dan.
Awesome. My name is Dan Lawrence. Like she said, I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called ChainGuard. Before starting this company about a year and a half ago, though, I was a software developer for a little over a decade. So my background comes from writing code, trying to secure code, and trying to help other developers write code as well. Today, most of my time and my team's time is spent talking to organizations, talking to development teams that are trying to write secure code, talking to security teams, trying to get things done in the face of these unfunded mandates that they're struggling with, and especially talking to open source developers too, who are left at the brunt of a lot of this writing code that they're not getting paid for, that's being used in critical applications. One of the big themes of software supply chain security that we've noticed is that it's really complicated. It's not one single problem. We're built on decades of technical debt, code that's been written over the last 30 or 40 years that folks are trying to fix. It covers everything from getting secure code in place, figuring out how it got there, making trust decisions around whether or not code can run in certain applications. It's a whole bunch of problems all rolled up into one. And it can lead to things feeling insurmountable. So we have a lot of work to do in this space. But thankfully, with the increased regulatory attention, with the increased attacks that are happening across the industry, I'm hoping they'll have enough attention and enough time to help solve this problem together.
Thanks. Jim.
Me? Hi, I'm Jim Higgins. I'm CISO of Snap, or Snapchat. My job is one that could be described as mortal terror. I live in between government and the developer, and it's where the intersection happens. You can pretty much describe my job from any scene in the movie Apocalypse Now. But in all seriousness, my job on a daily basis as CISO is not necessarily to secure things. It's to take a look at what the business is trying to accomplish or the products are trying to accomplish and work with the developers to understand the risk that's being introduced and find a way forward. So I spend a lot of my time in regards to software supply chain and software development, ensuring that our process encapsulates the developer rather than blocks the developer, right? And so we make sure that the environments that they operate in are free of vulnerabilities, or they have the scaffolding in place to not worry about things like XSS or SQL injection or whatever, so that they don't have to worry about security or security reviews, right? Get security reviews out of the way because the environment is secure. You can't fix everything, but you can ensure that, lack of a better term, the detonation of a bad event is contained. So balancing that risk with what the business needs to do is really my day-to-day job.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about some recent U.S. policy efforts. We've seen a lot of movement from the government recently. This includes President Biden's executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity. We have the new national cybersecurity strategy that was just released in March that works to shift the liability more to the software providers away from the end users. And then even more recently this month, we saw CISA, the FBI, and the NSA, along with some international partners, release guidance for manufacturers on how to build secure by design technology. So Camille, let's start with the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which I know you are very involved in. How does this address the issue, and how does it aim to fix the problem?
Yeah, the National Cybersecurity Strategy, which I hope you all have read, I'm not going to ask, but if you haven't, go read it, outlines similar to the Office of the National Cyber Director, an affirmative vision. We're no longer responding to the adversary. We're no longer reacting. How do we move towards an affirmative vision for what we would like to see? And part of that, and you'll see this throughout all of the pillars, whether we're talking about critical infrastructure or we're talking about cyber defense or our work with our international partners, is a thread about supply chain security. All of our supply chains are linked globally. We have to think about that when we think about critical infrastructure, when we think about defensibility, or when we think about all of it. And so software supply chain is no difference. And the strategy really outlines how we need to look at the most atomic unit all the way to the code through how we distribute software and the products that it's in. And so what you'll see in the strategy is there are two main shifts that we're pushing, but one is really integral for software supply chain, which is that long-term investment, right? We want to shift market incentives so that organizations are making long-term investments, not quick wins, not I want to just be first to market, not I want to just, throw a product out there that solves a problem but doesn't think about how it impacts the ecosystem. We really want products to be secure by design, to be thoughtfully created, and to really think about the long-term impacts. And so when you look at the National Cybersecurity Strategy, what you'll see, particularly around software supply chain, is that focus. You'll see it in the global supply chain conversation, you'll see it in the conversations about critical infrastructure. And in our work to start to implement that, we have really thought about what work needs to happen in the open source software ecosystem. What can the government do to support that ecosystem as it moves towards greater security? Because let's be frank, especially in open source software, the government should not lead. That is not our place in this evolution towards more security, right? But we can be supportive. So we undertook to do an assessment of where can the government be most effective? Where can we leverage our support? We can get our own house in order. Things like the EO outline that, and the strategy continues to do so. How we can invest in cleaning up code and dedicate time and talent to do that. We can make sure that the funding that we provide across the ecosystem accounts for supporting open source security investments. And we can really go back to that point about the most atomic unit and think about the code. And one thing that we identified is that memory safety is an opportunity for us to really have some scaled impact. It is not a silver bullet. Thinking about shifting the work that we're doing from memory unsafe languages to memory safe languages is not going to solve everything, but it is a place where if the government invests, if our partners across the ecosystem invest, we can see significant change. If large code bases migrated from memory unsafe languages to memory safe languages, we could see up to 70% reduction in security vulnerabilities. That's a place where we can really make a difference. And so what you'll see in the National Cybersecurity Strategy and in the implementation to come is us trying to identify the places where we can best serve across the software ecosystem, not just open source, but where we can invest and support industry, all of the other players in that evolution towards long-term investments, towards secure by design or secure by default, and not always be in the driver's seat. How can we let the market lead?
Right. Well, let's move on to the executive order now. And so one of the ways that it addresses software supply chain security is by setting these deadlines for federal agencies to really have a better picture of what is in the software that they use. So we have one of these deadlines coming up in June, I believe, and at that point the vendors will be required to submit letters of attestation, basically a guarantee saying that these products meet minimum NIST standards. So Dan, I'm curious from your perspective as a developer, what do you think about this approach?
Yeah, I think this self-attestation approach, the one that's coming up soon, is one component of this broader cybersecurity strategy. The way it starts, in case anyone isn't familiar, organizations that sell or are vendors to the federal government or federal agencies, folks in that sphere, are going to be responsible for submitting self-attestations claiming that they follow best practices that have been developed by NIST, mostly around the secure software development framework, but a bunch of other industry standard best practices as well. These get criticized a lot because it's just a self-assessment. It's a checkbox. Anybody can just go and check. But people do take these checkboxes seriously. As everyone already knows, it is a crime to lie to the government. Folks will not just check these at the end. CISOs have to take this seriously, and it does give them a lot of ammo to get funding and to get things done correctly inside of their organizations. It's not as perfect as a full third-party assessment where an auditor comes and verifies every single one of these check marks in this 800-page document, but it is still a good step that's going to get folks thinking about it seriously and taking action as we figure out the right way to do and scale those third-party assessments. Doing attestations that way does take a lot of time. It does have a lot of expense. So starting with the self-attestation deadline is going to be huge. It's also just one part of the broader cybersecurity strategy. Not everyone is a vendor to the federal government, but when you look at the supply chain, we're all somewhere in it. A couple degrees out, if you're writing open source code on GitHub, it's probably somewhere in someone's supply chain that makes it somewhere into someone's supply chain that is selling software to the government. So this is just one component of the broader cybersecurity strategy that is really comprehensive, and it looks at all of the different tools that we have at in our arsenal.
One quick addition to that,
Sure.
I think Dan pointed it out, but I just wanted to underscore that the federal purse is one of our biggest tools to influence market behavior and influence behavior. And so that illustration is perfect. One of the things that we try to do is if it is coming into the federal ecosystem, how can we leverage that as a place for change? Not just because third and fourth order effects of being a part of the supply chain, but just, now you know what you can demand of providers in your supply chain, because if they can meet that requirement for us, they can meet that requirement for you, right?
Kind of along those lines, Camille. So we have the federal purse, like you talked about. Then we also have the federal government and international partners offering this guidance on how do we secure technology by design. So how much do you expect that to move the needle?
I think it's the beginning of a conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not mandatory. This is guidance. It is a first step towards some of the implementation work from the National Cybersecurity Strategy, but it is really strong principles that we are looking for the private sector to react to tell us how that will change their production life cycles, all of these things, and then we can work together to think about how do we move that towards something that is a standard. I think also we've heard from a number of leaders and organizations that when they have something to point to from the federal government to say that this is a priority for us, it helps them be able to get the funding, the resources like we were talking about earlier, to invest in that kind of work. And so if this is something that can help Jim go to his leadership and say, hey guys, we got to invest in secure by design and secure by default, that's also something that's really helpful and will help shift market dynamics. But if that alone doesn't work, then we'll collaborate with industry to understand where there are gaps and how we take next steps.
And Jim, I want you to weigh in on this too. What do you think about the approach the government's taking?
What she said. But mostly, look, I just want to emphasize one thing in this space. It is not a government problem. It is not a private sector problem. It's an everybody problem. So we keep talking about supply chain. There's one key word in there, chain. If you compromise any part of the chain and inject code or whatever it is, then the entire chain breaks, right? It's the same way from, a policy standpoint and an industry standpoint. It is a common problem that we need to solve quickly. And I really appreciate the recent developments from the White House, because it really brings a lot of the ownership back onto the software developer, which is what we need. We need not only cooperation, but we need accountability as well.
Yeah, I'll add on that too. I love what you said about folks being able to arm themselves with these materials you're publishing. This is RSA, I know, but this isn't a problem you can solve just by purchasing some software and tacking it on like a firewall or something. This is a development problem. You have to change the way developers write software. They have to think about this from the start. You can't bolt it on at the end.
Yeah, it's not even a security problem. It's a code quality problem, right? It's a process problem that happens to produce some of the worst vulnerabilities known to man or to the world.
Yeah, and one of the solutions too is investing in changing curriculum for developers. I know your organization does work on that. We are looking at all of the ways that we can do that across the many different avenues of developers getting trained, whether it's in higher education or community colleges or boot camps. But the work has to start, to both of their points, in the training. This is not just it cannot be an afterthought, but our engineers, our developers have to think about security at the outset.
Perfect. Well, let's move into how we implement this a tactical day-to-day level here. Dan, your company is working, as you said, to secure the development process. So how do you implement the government guidance? What's that look like in reality?
Yeah, there's no easy answer. There's a bunch of different problems that need a bunch of different solutions to solve them. Supply chain security is really tough because of that. It's about the gaps between organizations. It's about the code I write, but it's also about how I get that code to you. It's about how your organization manages the code that they're consuming. Supply chain security is really about the security of the code and tooling along that way. So our approach to tackling that is to provide secure code and tools that folks can use along that journey. There are a bunch of different angles to it. We see vulnerabilities popping up across all aspects of the supply chain. From attacks on software vendors, like the famous one on SolarWinds a few years ago that kind of brought supply chain security to the spotlight, to a vulnerability in an incredibly commonly used logging library in Java that folks might remember with Log4j and Log4Shell. Two completely different attacks, two completely different vulnerabilities. The solutions for those don't resemble themselves in any way, but they all get lumped together into this supply chain security category. So our approach is really breaking it down, helping organizations identify which aspect they want to start out with first, because this really is a boiling the ocean kind of problem if you try to do it all at once. And then doing it at the core. So providing those secure foundations folks can build on top of.
And then Jim, what do supply chain best practices look like for you from a CISO perspective?
From a CISO perspective, it's the way we go about it. I have the benefit of being able to act quickly, a lot more fast than say a product or government. And so from our standpoint, we're in a better position at Snap because we can attest to every line of code that is authored, right? If we're building from open source, we build it ourselves. If we're pulling something from open source, we're building it ourselves. So the software supply chain issue is actually very easy to solve, just impossible to implement, right? Okay, if you can understand the inventory and the landscape and understand where all your code is coming from, you've solved 80% of the problem. The other 20% is around the mechanics of moving that code, building it and deploying it, but also understanding how that code changes, and when a vulnerability is discovered or introduced, how do you deal with it? Fortunately, the team at Snap has, and we learned from other companies like Google and Amazon and whatnot, have deployed those capabilities. So I live a luxurious life, but in that regard. But I'm not safe from Log4j. It's just when it happens, it's just a lot easier for me because the first part, the second part. The first part is crying and screaming. The second part is calling the board and say, we know where everything is, and it's a problem, but we got it under control. In a lot of the cases, it's not even a problem because of containment.
And what advice would you give to fellow CISOs who are listening today?
Oh boy, find another career path. But honestly, I would say inventory, as I said before, inventory is the most critical thing that you could possibly do to solve the software supply chain issue. Mm-hmm. What and where is your code? What is your code? Where is it stored? Where is it coming from? Honestly, I've been dealing with this for a very long time at different companies, and I promise you, if you can solve for that, you can solve the rest rather easily.
Great. So we have a sneak peek of some new data on developer and CISO security trends today that we're going to share. It's from an online survey in the US. It was conducted by the Harris Poll on behalf of ChainGuard. And they asked about 250 security decision makers and 250 developers about software supply chain security priorities, challenges, and opportunities. And a couple things I found. First, about 8 in 10 security decision makers, it was 77%, and more than 2/3 of developers, 68%, agree that the need to prioritize security causes tension between the two teams. It also found that more than 2 in 5 developers strongly agree that the software supply chain security practices shouldn't make it more difficult for developers to do their work. So I want to kick it over, Dan and Jim, and get your thoughts on this. Jim, do you see prioritizing security, do you see this causing tensions between the teams at Snap?
Anytime it's not just Snap, it's just nature, right? Anytime you bring in a point of friction, which is where two things meet, you're gonna, cause human contention, right? And it's just really, I think that the one thing that I try to implore upon my staff and the other side, the developers, is something called empathy. Try to understand what the developer's going through to get something done. They're under tremendous pressure, and then suddenly they run into something that slows them down. You better be making their life better. They better understand why you're doing that. And if you can't, then you probably should question whether that's the right thing to do or not. So in the case of software supply chain in general, it goes back to solve at the compiler. A developer won't argue with the compiler. Put your security checks, fuzzing, whatever it is you need. Well, Dan will argue with the compiler, but it's different. But at the end of the day, if you can automate your security, if you can create an environment and the scaffolding, as I said before, and prevent lateral movement in the case of a vulnerability, you're allowing the developer to do what they need to do, which is be creative while meeting extraordinarily tight timelines and working tremendously long hours. You're adding value into their lives. But also the other thing you do is you make them your security point of the stick, right? Or tip of the spear, whatever people say. Train them, explain to them, share information, communicate. The number one thing that you can do is communicate with your teams what the actual risk is. They're not stupid, they're gonna understand it. They're probably, I know all the developers are smarter than me. So, that was a joke, sorry. But that was an opportunity, sorry. They're very intuitive about what they're gonna know if you bring something to them that's not of value and you're just doing a checkbox or something to that effect, and you're gonna create a lot of tension at that point.
And so Dan, this idea of the security team being the roadblock to developers and not necessarily helping isn't a new one, but what do you see? Are these two groups getting closer to speaking the same language? Are we seeing progress?
Yeah, as a developer, you never want to get an email from security. You never want to get an email from your CISO in particular. I don't even work with him anymore. I'm not a developer,
I'm
but I
right
still
here.
don't like getting emails from him. It's scary. It's a scary thing to happen as a developer. You're trying to do your job. The last thing you want to do is introduce a vulnerability or cause some kind of data breach. So there's always tension in that relationship. But I think Jim described it perfectly before. I'd say 90% of the software supply chain problem is just keeping careful track of exactly what code is running where. There's no reason that has to be painful for developers. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's great. How many times have you spent a whole afternoon debugging print statements in code only to find out you had the wrong version deployed in staging or something like that? Being able to keep track of where code is also an immense boost for productivity. It can be used to increase the reliability of systems. It's not just a security thing. As we see investment here, in particular around technologies like SBOM or software bill of materials, they really are going to give developers a lot of extra tools. And if we can do this in a way where it's in the compilers, as Jim called it, natively inside all of the build tooling that developers are using, I see a really near-term future where developers don't have to think about software supply chain security. Computers are really good at keeping track of where code is, where pieces of data are. This isn't even big data, the number of lines of code, all of that. It's relatively small data compared to some of the other things that we're working on in the industry today. So once we get from that managing software in spreadsheets stage, most organizations I talked to were doing Log4j remediation in spreadsheets. Once we get a little bit beyond that to really modern technology like databases, we're going to see a lot more automation. People are going to start speaking the same language, and we can go back to complaining about security getting in our way in other areas.
And then Camille, excuse me, is this an area where Secure by Design software can help prioritize developer and security team priorities?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if this becomes a part of the ethos for the organization, a priority for the organization, to Jim's point, if it is a leadership level articulation of why this is a priority, how it maps across all of the different teams, why they should be thinking about these things, that only gets more buy-in and drives this being a part of the process development, or even how you build your tools that support your developers and how you support your security teams. That's a really big priority. And then it creates a lot of opportunity for us to get creative with how we leverage things like SBOMs. Like SBOMs, let's run it up against the CVE data. And once it's automated, to Dan's point, then we can automatically get a flag when your software flags against CVE data, and we can make this process a little bit more seamless. And so what we're hoping for is as folks invest in SBOMs and they're no longer a PDF on a computer that you're holding or in a spreadsheet somewhere.
Email attachments.
And it's automated, that we can do a lot more with it, and it only makes your life easier. So that inventorying is really important, and that is a part of Secure by Design for sure.
Yeah, I need to jump on that as well. That was well said, especially like with Log4j, we saw the attacks coming in for us at the other company I was at, within 60 and 90 minutes. It was automated, and we had automated attacks coming at us from the moment the CVE was released. I would like to fix how CVEs are released, but that's a whole nother panel.
Yes, on the list.
Well, and all of you at this point have brought up open source Log4j. We can't talk about software security without talking about the role of open source and securing open source software here. One report I saw said 96% of scanned code bases contain open source, and 76% of the code in code bases was open source. So Jim, let's start with you. What are some of the challenges specific to open source?
So I think the biggest challenge, and this is very sensitive, and I don't have an answer to how to address it, but is attestation of who's writing the code. Where's the code coming from? And that means identity. Do we create a global cyber identity for everybody to write code and whatnot? I don't think it's going to be a great outcome. But there has to be a way to attest to the validity of the software and the author and their intent. if I'm an attacker, and this is what I think about all day long, is if I'm an attacker, how am I going to put my infrastructure? I am going to get my code into whatever, have it signed, and then I don't have to worry about lateral movement because you do it for me, right? You propagate that code for me, or vulnerability, or whatever. And I think that, addressing, really we have to go after kind of the top 100 libraries that are out there and really start to solve the ones that, can inflict the most pain, including FFmpeg. Dan, can you fix that? Is critical, and that's where we start. But the identity piece and validating the developer is a huge privacy issue.
And Dan, what do you think about what are some of the potential risks here that we do see from potentially anonymous or foreign developers?
Yeah, open source is really complicated, especially in these conversations. When developers grab a piece of open source code from the internet, when they run npm install or pip install or, God forbid, curl pipe to bash, something like that, they're doing the equivalent of picking up a thumb drive they found on the sidewalk outside of RSA and plugging it into a laptop. Nobody likes to talk about that, but that's basically what's happening. And in some ways it's even worse because you're then taking that code and deploying it right into production. Stuff on your laptop is hopefully a little bit more isolated. And this is especially scary when you realize anyone on the internet can write open source code and can contribute to many of these projects. It's really scary if you've ever spent time on the internet and realized that not everyone is a nice person. The reality is most of the code running inside your organization is not written by your team anymore. It's like the tip of the iceberg kind of metaphor. When you start a basic web application and install some dependencies to get up and running, that's probably 90 to 95% of the code in your application from then on is written by other people that don't work for your company. Most organizations do code review, they do all sorts of testing of first-party code, but code that comes in from the internet, you just assume it's safe because everyone else is running it. There's so many scary threat models there that we've started to see attacked in the last several years. It's going to take a while to fix. The especially harder part with open source is there's no contract set up in most of these cases. You have a whole bunch of different tools to require practices and policies from your vendors, but open source is so ubiquitous at this point, and it's provided free with no warranty. You're taking it assuming all risk when you run this. You don't have any right or really argument to go ask those people that are doing free work for you to do more extra free work. The entire conversation is complicated, but it's so critical to our national security at this point because it powers so much of our digital infrastructure.
Oh yeah, like that one time, the U2. I remember Dan calling. The Air Force tweeted out that they had, was it 2018, 2019, that they had just updated the U2 live with via Kubernetes. And I was literally in the room at the time explaining that Huawei is the number 8 contributor to Kubernetes. And so I almost passed out at that point as I called the 16th Air Force and I said, "Is this for real? Are you really doing this?" And he said, "No, it's more for PR." But yeah, it is extremely complex.
And so we've been talking a lot about U.S. policy since we're lucky to have Camille here today. Jim, you have to also work with other governments, not U.S. governments. The EU has been doing a lot in this area as well. Are there any lessons that we can take from what the European Union and how they're approaching open source supply chain security?
I think that with the EU Resiliency Act, or whatever you call it, that's very interesting because it creates a, I wouldn't say a carrot, but a stick, because, not yet.
Here's the moment.
Just to demonstrate.
Because it really pushes the liability down to personal liability of the developer, especially if it's open source. You can be, held accountable for vulnerabilities in your code if you can't justify you didn't have good practices in place. I mean, the EU has brought us great things like GDPR and other things that are hard to implement, but in the end, they do truly have the end user in mind. But I do prefer the United States approach, which is to provide guidance and more carrot.
The carrot.
Yeah, thanks, dude. And I like the carrot over the stick. Because it's more cooperative rather than a brick being dropped on your head from space.
Less painful.
Yes.
So for our final question, since the theme is Stronger Together at RSA this year, I would like each of you to tell the other stakeholders up here what your wishes are for them, and what they can do to help you within your role solve this major issue of supply chain security, and make the entire ecosystem stronger together. So Camille, let's start with you.
I mean, these two are doing it, but I would say to all of you, tell us what you think, right? Tell us how the things that we are ideating and building will impact your business, will change your ability to deliver, will change the ecosystem. We want to understand. I mean, the reason we are doing this collaborative approach is because we recognize that we can't do this alone and we don't have all the perspectives. And even as we work to get folks from industry into government and vice versa, I mean, we'll never understand the real-time impacts of what the software liability schema we're thinking about will do to your organization in real time, what anything that we have decided to explore. And so that's why this has become such a collaborative endeavor. That's why the National Cybersecurity Strategy was so collaborative, and the implementation will be collaborative, because we want to make sure that we are headed in the right direction. We don't want to drive towards something that's going to have unintended consequences, or where we don't understand the full ramifications of the decision we have made. Now, we might not agree. I mean, every person might not agree, every organization might not agree with the path that we've chosen, but it's better for us to understand what those impacts are so we can mitigate for them and we can build together. And so that's why my Stronger Together plea is that continue to work with government. We genuinely want to understand what the dynamics of all of our policy decisions are, and how it impacts your organization. And so Office of the National Cyber Director, CISA, I mean, any of the agencies across the government that you have inroads with, tell them that information. It'll get back to us. So thanks for that.
Dan, you want to weigh in next?
Sure. More of the National Cybersecurity Strategy, honestly. I read it when it first came out. I've talked to tons of people, both in the policy space, across every political party, developers, CISOs, folks inside of companies. I've never seen a single technical document from the government be so universally praised. It's shocking. The only criticism I've heard is that it's not implemented yet. So please implement it, I guess. The reason it was, I think, so useful to folks and resonated so much is because of how comprehensive it was. It's a very complicated problem, like I said, like 10 times so far today, with different stakeholders and different incentives, and it actually addressed all of those with a framework for helping everyone along the way. So please implement it, I guess. And then for CISOs, stop making developers' lives harder. Stop
You just
ruining
want
our
my
lives.
budget.
Don't email me.
You just want my money.
Buy our software, it'll be great.
Okay.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, what's your wish
Can I
list, Jim?
possibly be taken seriously with the carrot?
Yeah, take it back.
Dan, don't listen to us. Keep doing what you're doing and move quickly, because we need your help. And that goes to anybody developing a product in this space. Think holistically, think inventory, and think automation. I've worked at large companies and small companies, and I've only seen a few that even come close to addressing this issue. So we're all at risk. And Log4j and SolarWinds and so on and so forth has shown that. And Camille, it used to be that the most terrifying thing I could possibly hear in any given day is we're from the government and we're here to help. However, you have changed that. This administration has changed that. I would ask that if you work through Google and Amazon and companies like that, that's great, because that does trickle down to us. But I would like to see more engagement in threat sharing and things of that nature, because we do have a lot of information as well in the private sector, and it becomes difficult due to national security boundaries, right? And with the EO and the new strategy, I'm very, very proud of this administration and what they're doing. So please do more of that, and your approach is appropriate. But also, help us help you. Was that
Up next
cryptic
is the-
enough? I don't know.
Yeah. Up next is the National Cyber Workforce Strategy, so help us get that right too.
That's actually
Good
the
fun.
biggest problem in another panel. But I go visit universities and whatnot because of this impending doom of lack of cyber training and
Yeah.
cybersecurity staff.
Go yell at CU Mo in the corner. He is leading that effort for me.
Well, we have a few minutes left, so I think we have a little bit of time to open it up for Q&A. Any questions for the panel? Oh,
Yes, and I would like to address this mainly to Camille in connection with the strategy. The strategy seems to me, as so many government strategies, to be extremely high level. And the government is behind in terms of really implementing the strategy even at slightly lower levels. We who have to deal with SBOMs, for example, are worried about the standards for it. There are two competing standards for SBOM, and the government has not really said to itself two questions. A, which one does it think does it think it better? Which one is it going to go with? And B, what's the time frame for the government to implement it on its own software, e.g. Iron Bank, all right? Is the government going to do SBOMs and related stuff for Iron Bank software so that we understand what really is involved in it? So that the government is doing what it says, what it wants to preach to the general population.
Yeah, let's start at the top of that question. A strategy by its very nature has to be high level so that we can cover so much. But you'll see a lot of detail in the implementation work. The strategy came out in March, and so unfortunately a strategy that comprehensive and expansive could not have been implemented by April. And so we are working on it, I promise. That is coming, more implementation work. As far as SBOMs specifically, as you can see from our approach, we are not being overly prescriptive. We do want to learn. And so the reason we haven't been as prescriptive, the work is in progress. We are learning from our partners as they seek to implement SBOM. So you'll see more developments there. But at this point, the best thing I can say is to be patient and be collaborative, because that's the way we get to the answers that you want. But I mean, we've only had a month or so, and so we're working on the implementation.
I'll add on there too. The SBOM formats are still changing weekly. Both community meetings we've been engaged in a lot. They're adding features. The space is still innovating rapidly. The last thing I would want right now is for the government to freeze and say everyone is stuck with this particular version forever. The creativity and innovation that folks are still doing in the space is nice.
So one insight and one question. So I'm responsible for software products with millions of lines of code, and the problem of creating inventory and solving problems is not simple at all. It takes a lot of time. So speaking from my experience, I think what made a lot of improvement for the world, the supply chain, is the CVE database, because it was standardized and it did not address all the problems, but it created big movement. We have multiple types of supply chain problems today. It could be reuse of the binaries, it could be reuse of the source code, and it could be various snippets copied from Stack Overflow, maybe from ChatGPT very quickly. So we need to think of a standard that will, a format or somebody that will, and maybe government is in a good place for that, to establish something that enables a complexity of technologies used in big software products to build this inventory. So I agree with the previous gentleman. And second point, doing software security is very costly. And for years, people were not doing it and not holding the bar. And the thing that really moves the needle is FedRAMP, actually. Because FedRAMP is fantastic. It sets set of best practices around security, then everybody else basically gets aligned because it's the same set of controls being recycled. I don't see anything in FedRAMP detailed enough addressing supply chains, neither about building inventory nor about how you enforce this inventory when you actually run the system. So maybe this is something you want to look next, or maybe you're already looking at, because this is what I think will really move the industry around. because your U.S. government is such a big buyer, and then everybody else will just get aligned with it, not just for government.
I love when suggestions align to things that are in progress. OMB is currently working on FedRAMP and reevaluating where there are gaps in the guidance. And so, yes, that is on the list. And if you have any connections to OMB, please do weigh in on that process. They'll be looking for feedback. And then I brought up the CVE issue as well. There's some evolution that needs to happen there, and it is definitely on the list on how we can make sure, the evolution of technology is met by the CVE program that we have. So it needs to evolve with it. Yeah.
Let's come over here.
I'll be quick, Duncan Sparrow. First, a comment to the SBOM question. I +1 to what Dan said. The fact there were two standards competing actually made them both better. Keep doing that. It's like JPEG and PNG. Yes, so we have two standards. They're both useful. But my actual question is on the stick that Dan showed that we didn't get into much. The cybersecurity strategy has in it the liability issue, which you guys did not touch too much. Can you say a little bit more on what the government plans to do there?
Yeah, that too is going to be collaborative. Lightest possible touch to achieve the desired outcome. The goal is not to go heavy-handed with regulation, but to really understand what the lowest common denominator is, that lowest baseline, and implement there, and then start to build from there so that we could get to the right balance of liability and regulation. I don't know what that is at this moment, because it really will be a collaborative process. Even in the way we've crafted it out in the National Cybersecurity Strategy was informed by that kind of conversation with industry partners. We've heard everything from just make it negligence to, things that are much stronger. And so we'll continue to have that process of conversation to figure out where that is.
Good day. Just a quick question, observation about liability, and a question for the government as far as standardization. We talk about open source. You're getting free work. You really have you have no expectation of security necessarily unless you reprogram it yourself. My worry is, with us trying to get into standards with Europe and Europe doing personal liability, are we looking at that? My concern with that is it stifles innovation. People will get out of that business as quick as possible. I'm not giving you free work when you could sue me for millions. And how do I get my free code off of everybody's stack? Because my code's in 20,000 programs right now. And if you come after me, after I say, I am no longer updating this, don't use this, and 4 years later you're still downloading my junk, I'm really concerned. So, thank you.
That is not currently a liability model we are pursuing.
Okay.
So, yeah. Okay. I don't have the answer yet, right? But that is not currently a liability model.
I'm wondering if we're looking to get
in alignment.
Okay.
I'm involved in about half a dozen open source foundations and groups, and I think every single one has written very long, detailed counter arguments against how this would play out in Europe if this stuff goes through as described.
Yeah.
I think universally feared.
Yeah, but don't underestimate the ability for an entirely new economy to suddenly surface up to solve the problem of regulation, right? There'll be new auditors and new, never mind.
I think we have time for one more.
Hello, I have a question regarding sharing SBOMs. So we occasionally have a request from customers to share our SBOMs, which we can't obviously because there are some IPs that are part of the software structure itself. Are there any suggestions on assuring the customer that the software itself is vulnerability free without sharing the detailed SBOM with them?
So I think the question was, I'll try to repeat it back. You have customers asking you for SBOMs, and you're worried in some ways that you'd be giving away IP if you share those SBOMs.
Yes.
You still want to be able to give them the assurances that it's vulnerability free without giving away the IP.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's one of the fears that I've heard a lot of organizations bring up when they talk about sharing SBOMs. Around not even just leaking IP, but giving attackers an easier way in. If you tell them exactly what versions of software you're running, they might be able to target better attacks. On the IP side, I don't know if there's an amazing easy answer here, but these are your customers. Hopefully you have agreements in place where they can't steal your IP or do anything with your IP. The security angle for it is always a little bit trickier though. If they leak, if the SBOMs get out, folks get more worried about what happens.
Okay, thank you.
Great, well thank you all for joining us, and thank you to the panelists. Hope you enjoyed our talk.
Nope.
job.